Welcome to Networking RX, a podcast devoted to helping business professionals like you enhance your networking skills in order to become more proficient giving and receiving quality business referrals and improving the overall quality of your life and the lives of those around you. The Networking RX podcast is a production of AmSpirit Business Connections, an organization whose mission is to empower business success through networking.
Welcome back for another episode. This is Frank Agan, founder and president of AmSpirit Business Connections. You are listening to the Networking RX podcast. I am your host. I'm always your host. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks to those who have subscribed and get this on a consistent basis. If you are a consistent listener, you know that from time to time I will have guests on. And today is one of those guest day. Today I have on with us Krister Ungerböck. He's a leadership communication expert, keynote speaker, and he's the former CEO of a global tech company. If you look him up, you'll find that his work has appeared in NPR, Forbes, HR.com, Chief Executive, Recruiter.com, and Entrepreneur. But prior to exiting corporate life at age 42, Krister was the CEO of one of the largest family-owned software companies in the world. And while leading the company to over 4,000% growth, his team won 5 consecutive top workplace awards, achieved remarkable employee engagement levels of 99.3%, and became a dominant player in its market niche. He's got a book coming out. It came out October 6th, and the name of the book is 22 Talk Shifts, Tools to Transform Leadership in Business, in Partnership, and in Life. And he helps people become better bosses and become better bosses by shifting their words. Krister, welcome to the podcast.
Frank, I'm happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation.
Well, let's talk about talk shifts. The title of the book, I mean, that's not a word that's it's your word, right?
Yes, it is. Trademark everything as far as probably by the time your viewers, listeners hear this. So,
if you could kind of give us some background on where it came from and.
Yeah, so talk shifts are really about how do we use our words to shift our own perspective and the people around us. And it really was informed by, I guess, really 3 different experiences. One was when in 2001, after September 11th, I moved to Europe to start the European operations of our software company. And I had the opportunity to learn to lead in 2 foreign languages so I learned in French and in German over the course of 6 years. And it was really interesting. I had already been a leader in English, but having to learn to lead is really building from the ground up our language. So language has always been a really big part of how I translate anything. And the second part was really just this: how can we use our own words to shift any relationship in our life? And this gives us to the kind of the key story that when I was 42 years old, I found myself at the YMCA signing up for a gym membership. And the woman asked me, "Who's your emergency contact?" And I broke down crying because in that moment I had no one. And what had happened is shortly before that, I had initiated what I call a business divorce with my business partners. And then 2 weeks after that, my wife initiated a divorce.
Oh my God. Yeah.
So I really had no one. And so I joined my business partner like 25 years previously, and we had all this conflict. And finally, after 25 years, I was like, it's time to buy the company. He was 75 years old. And, I'd worked 60 to 100 hour weeks every week, pretty much for 20 years. And we went from the company was struggling, 10 employees. And by that time I was CEO. I'd been CEO for 5 years, and we were 250 employees worldwide. So we were really an entrepreneurial company. And so I kind of assumed that we were going to figure out a way to kind of, resolve this conflict. And he came back 24 hours later and said, "There's really no price at which I would sell you any part of the company."
Oh my gosh.
And I had this moment. I said, this words that my father used to say rang in my ears as I walked out of the room. So, with friends like that, who needs enemies? except my business partner wasn't my enemy. He was my father.
Oh.
And so, basically I had this breakup with my business partner. My identity as an entrepreneur and CEO was kind of gone. And I started doing all this research, going through a marital divorce, and I run across the work of Dr. John Gottman, who's one of the top marital researchers. And he talks about how he predicts marital divorce. And what struck me is these same predictors he used for marital divorce actually would have predicted the breakup with every executive or business breakup I'd ever had in my career, including the breakup with my father.
Yeah.
And so I started thinking like, well, how can we use marital research to basically make better leaders and better business people? And as one of those business leaders who was, I would hope, by most standards, fairly successful, I was always reading business books. But I didn't really read that much in terms of relationships and general things, communication. So I wanted to write a book that would actually help people both in business, but then these same tools can be used with teenagers, they can be used with spouses, they can be used with parents to really repair relationships. And so I wrote this book and rewrote it 4 times. And the turning point with my relationship with my father was actually about a year ago, when I read him the last draft of the book. And about 3/4 of the way through, he can't, his eyes, he's now 80 years old. His eyes are kind of, his eyesight's not great. So I had to actually verbally read it aloud to him. And about 3/4 through the book, he said, I had no idea how much my words kind of had hurt you over the years. And it wasn't, if you look at it, he was just a really tough dad and a really tough boss, right?
Yeah. Well, they grew up in a different era. I mean, it's just
yeah. And admittedly, I turned into a very similar. I was a very dry, I drove my people very hard. That's one of the reasons why we, grew as much as we did. But what I realized is at the end that my heart was in the right place, but my words were not. And so some really subtle shifts to my own words we could have gotten so much more growth than we did. And I'm 100% certain it would have eliminated my business divorce with my family, which, that alone probably had a $10 million impact on our company.
Right.
Fortunately, the company's doing well. I hired a CEO before I left. But I mean, to lose somebody who's been with a company for 20 years, who's a critical player, I mean, that rarely has a positive impact on someone's business.
Right.
But also, in retrospect, if my wife at the time and I had practiced these talk shifts, I'm fairly certain it would have saved our marriage as well. So I wanted to write a book that would help business leaders and entrepreneurs, and really any leaders at any level, use the same words to improve relationships at all levels. And part of the impetus is I hired one of the best French teachers in the world in 2001 when I moved to Paris. And I asked him, how do you accelerate and learn a new language as quickly as possible? His name was Jean-Luc, and he said, Krister, you practice it everywhere. At home, at work, on the streets, you practice it everywhere. And that's really what these talk shifts are. You practice them everywhere, and you'll be able to accelerate both your business success and personal success more quickly.
Interesting. You get out, you work with groups, talk about, work with companies on these things, or is that how your business is working at this point? Or
a lot of what I do is really through keynote speaking and speaking to large groups. Obviously, the book is part of it, video courses, things like that. So really, my mission is to give people tools to help change their relationships in any format possible. I do with a small number of business owners. I do coaching for CEOs of growth companies, usually in the 25 to 100 employee range, to show them how to scale through the various steps of growth.
Okay. Have you had an opportunity then to? Is your father sold the business? Is it still a family business? Or?
It is. Yeah, I'm still an owner, and
okay.
The business is still 100% family owned. So despite, I don't know how many family business owners you have. Our story is not it's not very unique in family business. Like most family businesses have a fair degree of conflict behind the scenes. And actually, because of while there, like any transition, there's a lot of drama. My editor actually said it was like a episode of the HBO series Succession. But it's been a successful transition. The business is growing at the same rate as when I was leading it. Our profit margins are the same. So our current CEO's, he's over the last 4 or 5 years almost doubled the size of the business again, which is what we did the 4 or 5 years prior. So.
Now, in leading up to my research and talking with you, research such as it is, watching your videos, you talk about the compassion revolution. If you care to, I guess, talk a little bit about that and why it's accelerating in business.
Yeah. So one of the things that really shocked me is with, I was on a call with one of the CEOs that I coach, and it was with their executive team, and a young, like 10-year-old boy popped into the Zoom window. This is back in like April 20th or something like that. So we were in the middle of quarantine, and it struck me like everyone on the call just softened when this happened. And it struck me, would this have been really okay, 6 months or a year ago before COVID?
Yeah.
We have this unique window that everyone is starting to kind of be more compassionate as a leader. There's just it's been so much pain in the world. And what I've seen is that, it's now October. To what degree have people gone back? Like, people are going back to work. Are we going to go back to the old ways where we just kind of beat people up? Or are we going to retain that compassionate sense of how we lead? And this book, Talk Shifts, is really tools to sustain that kind of compassion revolution that I think is coming. I think that one of the things I see is that compassion is like the new emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence has been around for a long time. And admittedly, I thought I was emotionally intelligent. The difference between compassion is emotional intelligence plus action. Even when you look at emotional intelligence, a lot of the books, they never really translate that into like, what are the words that you use to be emotionally intelligent? It's just kind of like this philosophy that we're expected to just somehow naturally adapt. And one example that I use in the book is English speakers have a little bit harder challenge with being more emotionally intelligent, because usually one aspect of emotional intelligence is being able to recognize what emotions we're experiencing and communicating those emotions. And in English, we often say, well, I feel like you did that on purpose. And you'll find in a French or a German thesaurus, if you look the word feel, which is sentir in French, for example, and you look it up in a French thesaurus, you won't see the word penser, which is to think, as a synonym. But in English, the words think and feel are actually synonyms. So when I say I feel like you did that on purpose, it's I think that you did that on purpose. I'm not talking about my emotions.
Right.
So sometimes our own language fools us into thinking that we're actually being emotionally intelligent and we're talking about our feelings or our emotions.
Right.
But we aren't. And so the simple antidote, this is one of the 22 talk shifts, is if you talk about your feelings or your emotions, you only need 3 words. I am an emotion word, or I feel an emotion word. If you use more than 3 words, you're probably talking about a thought.
Okay.
So I feel sad, I am angry, I feel angry. That's kind of the antidote. So this is an example of one of the simplest talk shifts of how we take something that's a common mistake in business and in life and correct it through a simple language rule.
Yeah, and I want to touch on this quickly. We'll talk about your assessment, but I took the assessment, and one of the questions in the assessment was, I feel that do you agree or strongly agree, disagree? There's a scale there. And I'm prone to saying, well, I feel, I try to use couching words, but I'm reluctant to push it off on somebody else. I feel that you did that on purpose. Even though you put that feel in there, it becomes combative. It's almost like it's not even heard by the person you say it to. So it's.
But the thing that you notice is once you become aware of these little language patterns, you'll hear them, your listeners, and you will hear it probably 5 times before the end of the day.
Yeah.
You just listen for I feel that, I feel like. We do it all the time. I still find myself saying it, but knowing that and starting to use these kind of correction, what's the alternative? And if you're not in an emotionally charged conversation, it doesn't really make a difference. But if you're in an emotionally charged conversation with a customer or an employee or a spouse or a child, then using these things to be a little bit more aware. Your score, the talk shift, as you know, you took it at talkshift.com/quiz.
Right.
Your score was like, you were in the top 10%. So for you, the talk shifts, many of them are probably going to be
but Krister, I'm a work in progress. I never say I am anything. I try to be, right? Because I'm always one day away from doing something stupid. So I just try to.
Well, that's probably one of the reasons why you scored in the top 10%, because you've been working on yourself for a lot. So, the interesting thing, what we found, I just did this research in the last week, is the people who score in the top 25% on some of the key questions on the thing actually are twice as likely to have no frustrating relationships in their life. And so we're actually seeing correlations between the people who are scoring highest on the quiz and so that basically means the talk shifts work, right? People who are practicing them. The challenge is many of us, many of the people who do score highest on the quiz don't actually realize. So consciously knowing you're doing something right versus doing it correct on accident, that's an important distinction to make, right?
Right.
But then there's the obviously the 75% of people who are not scoring as high is more the concern.
Well, I would imagine that those are the people who don't know, don't care. I mean, I put people in different buckets. There are, it's like personal development. There are people out there that don't think that they need to personally develop, right? And then there are people who know they need to personally develop, but they don't care, right? And then there are other people that are personally developed, but they're not really sure as to what they should be doing. And it's a small segment that's personally developing and doing the right things. And it's kind of the same thing with the talk shift.
Well, I think one thing, here's a couple of things that we say. Well, I don't know if I would necessarily agree. The data, people are seeing this quiz and saying, hey, find out how you do on a quiz. Well, who takes a quiz? It's people who care, right?
Right, yeah.
So if the quiz is saying you're in the bottom 25%, you're in the bottom 25% of people who chose to take a quiz to see how they can improve, right? So that's one thing. But the other thing is we see no correlation between level of success, at least measured by how large of a team people are leading. There's no correlation. You could be a leader of a 100-person team or not a leader of a team at all. And there's no correlation in terms of just because you're more successful doesn't mean you're any better at doing these things. And also it doesn't mean that you have, there's no correlation between that and this, having fewer frustrating relationships in your life. So,
right.
And admittedly, I mean, I guess I was an example. I was, probably on the higher end of the success spectrum, but I probably would have been on the bottom 10 or bottom 25% on these talk shifts. Which is why I didn't have an emergency contact for quite some time.
Right. Well, I guess my question is, to what extent does the confirmation bias or the what I call the Lake Wobegon effect, people thinking they're better than they are. My old bosses thought they were great. Hey, we're wonderful. We were talking before I hit record. I worked in a large accounting firm, and it was old school. Who do I need to fire to get something done around here? You were deathly afraid. But if you would talk to them, it's like, oh, I'm good.
Well, so you didn't take this part, or you didn't see this part because I was just in the process of changing it. But there's actually a step 2 of the quiz, which is exactly that, which is to share your results with someone else and confidentially ask them whether they agree. And that is the really the most powerful thing. So I see it sometimes with couples or a boss and an employee where I, as a boss, think I'm granting a bunch of autonomy to people, but actually people don't agree. In fact, when I left my company, the reason I went to go and say, hey, I need to buy the company is because I felt I didn't have the autonomy to continue growing the company at the rate that we were.
Right.
Now, my father, who is the controlling shareholder, owns 51% of the company. He thought that he was giving me all the autonomy I need. But my definition of what an autonomy is like, for me, it was like, do I have the latitude to go and make $1 million investment to double the size of the company? And his definition was not that, right? So,
right.
And then in the talk shifts give specific language questions and conversation templates that two people can engage in to resolve that specific problem. is another one of the 22 talk shifts. So,
well, that's something that's the next step I need to take, because that's the important piece. How I view myself is nice.
Yeah.
But how other people view me is most important.
So, the last person to know who he's a micromanager?
The micromanager.
The micromanager. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I'm fairly concerned. Like, there's a lot of people out there who do have frustrating relationships with bosses or whatever. And I mean, I was a pretty difficult boss. I had no idea. But there was never a single day that I woke up and said, you know what, I think I'm going to be a jerk today.
Right.
So the people who are micromanagers, the people who frustrate us, often they have no idea what those behaviors are that are so frustrating to other people.
Or when they're pointed out, what we tend to do is we judge other people in black and white, but judge ourselves in these shades of gray. Yes, I'm a micromanager, but I have to because I've underhired here. I've got a weak link, or whatever it might be. And they're a weak link because you never give them the opportunity.
It is so common how we create our own. I find this often with entrepreneurs, and admittedly, when I was first leading teams, when I moved to Europe, we were started with like a 3-person company. I had 3 people that I brought over with me. And I had that like, I got to micromanage this person because they're not performing. And as I grew as a leader, I realized that a lot of that was actually my own creation. And I saw some people who actually maybe didn't thrive under my leadership. I saw them thrive under other leaders' leadership. And that's what started to really question, like, okay, maybe the problem wasn't them. Maybe it was me.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I try to check myself, reflect and look on things. Could I have done this differently? I want to proceed without ruffling feathers, if you will. Breaking China is probably a better example, because you can't put it back together, right? It's Humpty Dumpty. You can't unring the bell. There's 100 cliches. And I just find that it's easier to take the time on the front end to get the words right.
Yeah.
As opposed
I have to tell this story because you talked about breaking China. Have you ever heard of kintsugi?
No.
So I ran across this. One of the chapters in the book is about how we apologize and kind of repair broken relationships at work or at home. And there's this Japanese art called kintsugi. And if you look it up, it's basically the art of repairing broken pottery with like a lacquer of gold and silver. But the goal of which is actually to make the repaired piece more beautiful than the original, which is a great metaphor for relationships. A relationship, business or personal, that's broken, that becomes repaired, is much more resilient and actually much more beautiful than the one before. But there's specific words and specific techniques for doing that. And admittedly, as much as I had read about this kind of stuff, it wasn't until we kind of break it down into a specific recipe for how to do it that I think makes the big difference.
Great. The one thing I do want to get in here is, and I saw it in your video, you have a program out there where people buying the books, you share the profits. And if I would be happy to do that, make that available. I would like to give the profit, whatever my share is, to charity or whatever charities you've designated. If you're open to giving.
Any influencers who have large mailing lists or large followings, I have an opportunity that if they sign up on the talkshift.com/spark, they can sign up. I'll get them a special link. And anybody who purchases the book, or actually any products, I've got video products, coaching, things like that, I'll give 50% of the profits back. And then whether you want to keep your percentage of the profits, if you choose to donate it to charity, then I'll match the dollar for dollar, which means if you give all of your profits to charity, then I'll give all of mine.
Sounds great. Well, I will commit to giving it away. There's lots of need in the world, especially now. Try and get your book out there. What's the best way to get a hold of you? Somebody would like to have you come in. They'd like to have you speak, work with their team.
The best is to go to talkshift.com.
Okay.
If you take the quiz, then you can get the book. But at the same website, talkshift.com/quiz, you can see my speaking videos and what I talk about. But when I come in to talk in organizations, it's really the fastest way to create a cultural change in an organization broadly is really to do where I do a talk, whether that's virtual or in person, to really move people to action and start to change their words and change how they lead, both at home and at work.
One last question. Who's your emergency contact?
Well, so 4 years after my day at the YMCA, I actually did my first ultra marathon, and I had never run more than a 5K in my entire life. And I met this guy named Miles 1 mile before the end of this ultra marathon, which is the last time you want to see somebody named Miles.
Right? Oh, yeah.
And we were exchanging our stories, and he said, you know what happens? He said, what would you have said if 2 months ago I told you that you were going to run an ultra marathon today or finish an ultra marathon today? And I said, you know what, Miles, I would have said, that's the version of me that I'd be dying to meet. And he said, you know what happens when you become the version of you that you're dying to meet? Other people are dying to meet that version of you too, whether it's your spouse, your parents, your children, your employees. And the next day after this ultra marathon, I went to the airport, and there's those little back rub places, right. And I'm in pain, and I fill out the paperwork to get a little back rub, and you flip over this piece of paper, and it says, well, who's your emergency contact? And it was the first time that I'd seen that question for 3 or 4 years, and I actually my tear came to my eye because I had actually put my father's name down. So these talk shifts were actually instrumental in me kind of recovering my relationship with my own father. In fact, the same thing, while I did end up getting divorced, I have a very good relationship with my ex-wife. And I credit the talk shifts and now also my children. So, and I credit the talk shifts and the fact that I actually practice these things in my own life.
Yeah.
With a big, certainly as a big reason. If they worked for me, and I was probably not I wasn't on the high end of the emotional intelligence scale. If they work for me, I think they can work for a lot of people who are probably much better starting point than I was.
Yeah. I really appreciate your time on the program today. 22 talk shifts with Krister Ungerböck. Krister, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us on the Networking RX podcast. Please put what you've learned into action today and let us know if you have questions, comments, or ideas for future topics. You can email them to us at podcast@amspirit.com. That's AmSpirit.com. Finally, so you never miss an episode, be sure to subscribe to the Networking RX podcast through iTunes, Overcast, or however you receive your podcasts. Now get out and network with someone.
The Networking RX podcast is the copyright production of AmSpirit Business Connection. All rights reserved.